and newcomers to the South Orange Library Lecture Series. Thank you all for coming today. You're going to thank me because we have one of my very favorite speakers, Doug Simon, who first spoke here on February 9th, 1989, on the topic Vietnam Retrospective, 20 Years After Tet. This was a lecture, here's what I had written in my thing. This was a lecture based on Professor Simon's role in the Vietnam War as a military advisor. Then on October 12, 1989, you spoke, listen to this, New Faces of Communism and How It Affects U.S. Foreign Policy. 1989, do you see a little bit of history repeating itself? April 19, 1990, The Nature of International Conflict in the Current Decade. And we were talking about the decade of the 90s. After that, Doug came twice a year to give me all the insight into what was happening throughout the world. He called it World Political Status Report. Some of it wasn't as bad as some, and now I don't know. I'm sure he has a lot to say, and we have a lot to learn by what he's saying. Doug, you're brilliant. You're able to teach us so much in such a limited amount of time. I don't know how you do it, that you know what's happening all over the world. I have learned so much from you. You come for free. He speaks, I mean, he's taught at Drew University, political science. He's spoken at other places. But your loyalty to me is amazing. I have to thank you personally. And of course, my group, who, if they haven't been here from 1989 on, they will appreciate you after today, and they're going to say, Phyllis, I don't know, he's wonderful. Thank you for getting him. So I'm not going to take the credit. He's the one. So please, I always thank all of my fellow friends and librarians for all of their help and support for these programs, and I couldn't do it without them. And now, please, we have a lot to learn. Please, let's give a very warm welcome to our very, very special guest.
Thank you, Phyllis, for that introduction. I better be halfway decent after an introduction like that. Once again, it's a pleasure to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces, but I also see some new faces that I haven't seen before, and it's nice to have a large crowd like this. I must tell you that, and I'm absolutely honest about this, that putting together this talk is one of the most challenging things I've done in many, many years. The man who is now president, the style of his operation, the people he has surrounded himself with, and the many things he has said, both during the campaign as well as his first couple of months in office, and yes, his tweets, have made it a real challenge. And the first thing I want to make clear is that I have really no intention of turning this into some full-scale assault on the president, nor do I desire to make this some kind of a cheerleading session. I'm neither MSNBC or Fox News. I will do my best to give as analytical assessment as possible. And that will include comments on opportunities that the Trump approach may offer, as well as some issues of deep concern that I have about the direction of American foreign policy. Perhaps the first thing we need to do is to try to get some handle on what Donald Trump's worldview is, and that is not easy, for he, as noted during the campaign and also in the White House, is prone to a good deal of hyperbole and contradiction in what he says, but I will give it a try. Last September, when I was here, I mentioned a rather remarkable article entitled Trump's 19th Century Foreign Policy, written by Thomas Wright of the Brookings Institution. If you were here, you may recall that Wright likened Trump's views to those conservative figures such as former Ohio Senator Robert Taft and Charles Lindbergh. Taft, of course, unsuccessfully ran for the Republican nomination in 1940, 48, and 52. He was a staunch isolationist and mercantilist, who opposed U.S. aid to Britain before 1941. After the war, he opposed Harry Truman's efforts to expand trade and also opposed containment of the Soviet Union, believing that the U.S. had few interests in Western Europe, and was opposed to the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Lindbergh was a populist in addition to crossing the Atlantic by air. He was a populist, an isolationist, and openly expressed a degree of admiration and friendliness toward authoritarian leaders. Now, I won't repeat word for word everything I said last year in relaying Wright's analysis, but a quick summary is appropriate. First, Trump believes in extreme military strength and really trusts no one, neither the Russians, the Chinese, nor our allies for that matter. For Trump, an overpowering military is required to always deal from strength. It was not for frivolous reasons that he has called for a $54 billion increase in military spending without any comprehensive strategy as to how new weapons would be used and against whom if needed. Possession of a powerful military is an end of itself. But even with a strong military, he also believes that the United States has got to stop engaging in what he considers to be reckless and wasteful military interventions. Many analysts believe that he is downgrading the whole counterinsurgency thrust of the American military that goes back over 50 years to Vietnam. Second, President Trump is deeply unhappy with America's allies and feels we are overcommitted around the world. Over many years, on many occasions, including during the campaign, Trump has expressed the belief that the U.S. is being taken advantage of by its allies. He is not enamored with NATO and would prefer that the U.S. not have to defend other nations. But if it does, he wants to get paid as much as possible for it. He is particularly hard on Japan and South Korea, but does not take Europe off the hook either. And this feeling about allies seeing to their own defense forms the basis for his comment during the campaign that perhaps it would not be so bad for other nations to have nuclear weapons and not have to depend on the United States providing a nuclear shield. Third, he feels that America is disadvantaged by the global economy, specifically unfair trade arrangements, cheap labor countries enticing an exodus of American manufacturing, and currency manipulation, specifically by the Chinese. In order to fight this system, he is prepared to abandon multilateral trade agreements he feels are detrimental to the United States economy and to engage in tariff protectionism, if need be, to reinvigorate the American economy. Fourth, during the campaign, he demonstrated a peculiar sympathy toward authoritarian strongmen, not the least of whom was Vladimir Putin. I am not convinced that he in some way approves of Putin's policies, which include numerous human rights violations and trampling on the sovereignty of other nations. I just think Donald Trump admires executive decisiveness and strength. More on the Russian question later. I also think it is relevant to link these views to those of Steve Bannon, the president's controversial White House strategist. Mr. Bannon has articulated his views long before joining Donald Trump, but was particularly effective in enunciating them at the recent Conservative Political Action Conference in Washington. One core idea is that of economic nationalism, the belief that we must control our domestic economic system. We are a national economy, not merely a part of an integrated global economy. Globalization has threatened that control, which is essential for our security and well-being as a nation. Protectionist policies such as tariffs, strict control of immigration, and opposition to unbalanced trade are part and parcel of the concept. Economic nationalism is not isolationism in the traditional sense. The system demands engagement, but on ruthlessly competitive terms. Linked to the idea of economic nationalism is that of sovereignty, something Bannon believes the United States has been losing control of for decades, actually a process that began in the post-World War II era when we began building a multinational, multilateral global infrastructure with organizations like NATO, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and hundreds of others. Strict control of immigration is part of restoring our sovereignty, including limiting the number of outsiders to our shores. That is why I believe there is a linkage between the securing of our southern border, enhanced deportation policies, and the travel ban from 7 Muslim-dominated countries. Making the case that the travel ban is based strictly on anti-terrorist grounds is a tough sell for a variety of reasons. But given the mass migration of Middle Easterners and North Africans into Europe, beginning to put strict controls on travel from the Muslim Middle East makes sense. It particularly makes sense if one takes into account the particularly hostile attitude of Mr. Bannon toward Islam ever since 9/11. Bannon consistently expressed a view of the world based on Samuel Huntington's famous article, The Clash of Civilization, written in 1993 in the journal Foreign Affairs. It was a very famous article. A growing and monolithic Islam and the West that emerged out of the Enlightenment constitute 2 of the civilizations in conflict with each other. Well, I hope this at least offers some understanding of President Trump's foreign policy views. Of course, these viewpoints open up a whole list of questions. Are these tenets of foreign policy even realistic in today's globalized world? Will a Republican-dominated legislative branch support the dismantlement of multilateral free trade arrangements, a concept historically supported by the Republican Party? Is the pursuit of these policy objectives wise, or will they prove destructive? Could they lead to a dramatic spike in inflation or a full-scale trade war? Is the abandonment of counterinsurgency and a return to a massive nuclear conventional army, navy, and air force realistic in today's world? And of course, there are a host of both moral questions and practical questions that confront us with policies like immigration. And perhaps most critical is President Trump's America First orientation, along with the rise of nationalism in Europe, with leaders like Marine Le Pen emerging in France, and the UK's vote to exit the European Union, Brexit. Is this movement going to damage, if not destroy, the carefully crafted multilateral international order of the post-World War II era? It is an order built on organizations like the United Nations, the International Labor Organization, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the World Meteorological Organization, and the International Postal Union, as well as strong regional organizations. It is an order brought about in part because of the destructive hyper-nationalism that characterized the pre-World War I era that eventually led to 2 world wars. It is an order built on the belief that the international system needed some sense of organization, some rational regulation, some rules of the game on things like political conflict, international trade, international travel, and shipping and the like. Now, given time limitations, what I'd like to do is move a bit from the theoretical to a few real-world issues, namely our relations with Russia, China, and the Middle East. And obviously, I'd be more than happy to try to expand that list a bit in a Q&A session. The future of U.S.-Russian relations is almost impossible to predict, given the statements and actions of the new president and his advisors. You know, roughly the time when Vladimir Putin decided to seize and annex the Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea in 2014, a question began to float around the foreign policy circles in Washington, D.C., and Moscow, London, Bonn, and virtually every other major capital of the world, and particularly in Europe. Was the West, led by the United States, headed for a new Cold War with Russia? In the years leading up to the election of Donald Trump, it would appear that events might lead one to that conclusion. U.S. relations were not particularly good with Russia. Both the Bush and Obama administrations had attempted to reset relations between the two countries, but to no avail. Many European countries were terrified that Russia and the United States were headed down the path of greater tension and ultimately could lead to violent conflict threatening their security. Recent events have changed the nature of that concern. To be sure, Europeans are still worried about their security, but for different reasons. The fear now is that the U.S. under the new president is somehow angling for a new understanding with Russia, that in the process would weaken NATO and assure the Russians that the United States would not adversely react to Russia acting to expand its influence in what is known as the near abroad. That is, the former republics of the old Soviet Union like Georgia, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And the former East European satellites like Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic are worried as well, along with the Scandinavian countries like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, as well as nearby Finland. The reason for concern is obviously what is being termed the Trump-Russian connection, which goes back to Trump's effusive praise of Vladimir Putin during the campaign, the numerous contacts between many of Trump's advisors and officials in the Kremlin during the same time period, Russia's interference in the American electoral process, as well as Trump's disparaging remarks about NATO. To be sure, several of the president's foreign policy team, most notably the Secretary of Defense, former General James Mattis, as well as Vice President Mike Pence, have made efforts to calm European nerves. They have made recent statements that A, Russia will be held accountable for its actions, and B, that NATO is still a centerpiece of American security policy. But Europeans are having a difficult time reconciling these assurances with some of the statements made by the man in the White House. Despite all kinds of denials of relations with Russia, Donald Trump's ties to the Soviet Union and later Russia go way back some 30 years, when on 2 occasions he began exploring the possibility of building a hotel in Moscow. First he met with Soviet Ambassador Yuri Bannon and later with Mikhail Gorbachev himself. By the 2000s, corporate bankruptcies had limited Donald Trump's access to capital markets. He managed to join forces with Bayrock, a New York property developer founded by Soviet-born newcomer to the U.S., Tevlik Arif, to pursue deals around the world. Throughout this same time period, with the assistance of Russian real estate broker Ilya Reznik, Russians were buying millions of dollars of Trump-branded real estate in the United States, particularly along the coast of Florida. In 2008, the Russian oligarch Dmitry Ryabov bought Trump's Palm Beach mansion for $95 million. And in and around the same time, Trump's son, Donald Jr., stated, "Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets. We see a lot of money pouring in from Russia." And of course, there's Aris Aglarov, another Russian billionaire who signed a $14 million deal to bring Trump's Miss Universe pageant to Moscow in 2013. Now, as far as I can tell, there was nothing wrong with all of this. A wealthy businessman buying and selling property to wealthy Russian oligarchs. But it does indicate that Trump was no stranger to Russia, and a lot of money changed hands. But then, as we know, things started getting complicated when Trump threw his hat into the ring and selected Paul Manafort to chair his campaign for president. Manafort had been advising the pro-Moscow former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who was ousted from power in 2014 amid allegations of massive embezzlement. Yanukovych had to flee to Russia. Ukrainian authorities found a ledger showing a $12.7 million off-the-book payment to Manafort from Yanukovych's party, payments Manafort has strongly denied receiving. Further, Manafort's interpreter had a background in Russian military intelligence, and amid all the controversy, Manafort left the campaign. The Manafort problem was then compounded when Carter Page, a Merrill Lynch banker and Trump foreign policy advisor, was forced to resign over Russian links. Page was an advisor to the Russian state energy company Gazprom that had been heavily involved in using access to natural gas as a weapon of leverage against former republics of the Soviet Union, now independent countries like Georgia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. We know that J.D. Gordon, another Trump aide, met with Russian Ambassador Kislyak during the Republican convention in July of last year. Michael Cohen, Trump's personal lawyer, was linked to the pro-Russian faction in Ukraine. And as we got closer to the election, we know that a number of Trump advisors were in touch with Russian officials. The most well-known was General Michael Flynn, soon to be named National Security Advisor. We now know that at the same time that President Obama was laying economic sanctions on the Russians for hacking into the Democratic Party computer system, Flynn was on the phone several times with the Russian ambassador, and we now know that one of the topics of those conversations were the sanctions. Flynn resigned from the position of the National Security Advisor because he had lied to the Vice President about the substance of the phone calls. And most recently, we hear of Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who met with Russian banker close to Vladimir Putin. Now, as being claimed by the White House, maybe all of this was fairly innocuous, innocent, except for two things. First, the failure to be very forthcoming about the contacts, and second, the preponderance of these contacts and more overlapped the presidential campaign and the hacking of the Democratic Party server first detected in April of 2016, before Trump became president. When the hacking was detected, the computer security firm CrosStrike was immediately brought in, and they determined several things. First, that the hacking had begun a year earlier, during the spring of 2015. Second, that the hacking had all the earmarks of a very sophisticated operation as opposed to the often sloppy, amateurish operations of renegade hacking groups. Third, that the hackers' objectives were not the kind of nuisance operations that amateurs often conducted. The perpetrators had infiltrated virtually everything of value to a political opponent. Personal file folders, office chat threads, digital voicemails, donor lists, including credit card information, and the email content of virtually everyone's mailbox. There is very, very strong evidence that two Russian groups named Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, with close ties to Russian intelligence, were indeed behind the attacks. And further, that the code name Guccifer II was the front for the Russian operation. Guccifer II is the party that Trump advisor Roger Stone now admits what he was in contact with several times during the campaign, and he is now under FBI investigation. As of this time, and to the best of our knowledge, there is no smoking gun that supports the assertion that Vladimir Putin directed the attacks personally, although there are many in Washington, including some Republican legislators, as well as almost the entire intelligence community, that believe he did. And it is important to note that as of right now, there's absolutely no hard evidence that candidate Trump even knew about the hacking before it occurred, before it was discovered. Even more important, there is absolutely no evidence that he was in any collusion with Russian authorities about the attacks. But obviously, what makes people nervous are all the contacts between Trump advisors and Russia during the campaign, as well as his effusive praise of Vladimir Putin. What will come of all of this is difficult to say. Will an independent counsel or commission be appointed to investigate the Trump-Russian connection? I don't know. Will the congressional investigations or the Senate investigations turn up anything terribly incriminating? We just don't know. In the broader strategic sense, what is going on here? Is all of this a red herring? Merely innocuous conversations of a potential administration opening up channels of communication with the Kremlin? Or is all of this maneuvering by the Russians and the Americans in places like Syria, the Baltics, and now the Balkans a prelude to an attempt by the Trump administration to strike some kind of grand bargain with Russia? Some have speculated that such a bargain would perhaps tie Russia and the United States into a joint effort to defeat ISIS and convince Russia to end its cooperative ties with Iran, maybe in exchange for some understanding that the U.S. would moderate its response to Russian pressure on the former republics of the old Soviet Union, and perhaps some downgrading or de-emphasis of NATO. Or maybe President Trump's praise of Putin and the varying ties of his advisors are to lay groundwork for playing the Russian card against the Chinese. After all, of all the threats to America identified by Trump during the campaign, China was at the top of the list. This is a new history unfolding before our eyes, and while there are troubling questions surrounding the nature of the new administration's relationship with Russia, it is extremely difficult to predict where it is leading. This is a story that we're just going to have to watch unfold a bit before we can get a better picture of what in fact is going on. Now, of all the adversaries facing the United States, Donald Trump placed particular emphasis on China. Clearly, he sees China as an economic and increasingly a military threat to American interests. The list of transgressions to earn this status includes currency manipulation, copyright violations, unbalanced trade, as well as military threats in both the East China and South China Seas. In response to these transgressions, both as a candidate and later as president, he constantly harped on the unfair trade relationship with China and repeatedly called for a heavy tariff on Chinese imports as high as 45%. Now, indeed, there are some troubling aspects to our relationship with China. The most obvious is a huge trade imbalance favoring China by some $347 billion in 2016 alone. Recently, a task force of China experts convened by the highly respected Asia Society in New York released a report essentially backing the president's Get Tough policy with China. In the report, the experts argued that an increasingly protectionist and mercantilist China had left the U.S. no other option but to get tough after the failure of diplomacy and more moderate trade actions. The report does not, however, endorse the imposition of high tariffs on Chinese goods coming to the United States. Instead, it calls for tougher U.S. enforcement of both domestic and international trade rules, and for the Trump administration to do more to press China to open up sectors of its economy in which foreign investment is now restricted. They argue that those actions should be paired with efforts to draw China into new trade and investment deals with the United States. Thus far, while the president has verbally asserted the intention for a tough stance on China, he has avoided adopting any corrective tariff policy. There's a lot of nervousness in the business and foreign policy community about instigating a tariff-based trade war with China, and the president knows that. But there is room for some tough negotiating. The United States is China's largest foreign market, and many economists believe that China needs the United States more than the United States, in fact, needs China. So perhaps there is some accommodation that can be reached. But trade is not the only issue troubling the relationship, and an all-out trade war would no doubt exacerbate those other problems, one of which are moves by China in the East and the South China Seas. But before I comment on that, allow me to make a quick comment on one of Trump's first acts in office, pulling the United States out of any consideration of joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, or TPP, as it was known. The TPP was a multilateral free trade agreement between the United States and 11 other countries: Australia, Canada, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, Peru, Vietnam, Chile, Brunei, Singapore, and New Zealand. It was potentially a big deal, if for no other reason than the 11 countries constitute roughly 40% of the world's economy. The agreement was a free trade agreement with provisions for the elimination of some 18,000 taxes and tariffs that other countries put on American goods. They would go away. One thing about its demise should be made perfectly clear. While President Trump will no doubt take credit for pulling the U.S. out of the agreement, the fact is it was dead on arrival before he even took office. Opposition to the agreement in this country came from both the left and the right, and I doubt seriously if it ever got before the Senate that it would have been approved. Among its many alleged shortcomings would be a job killer and result in more unbalanced trade. Now, I must confess that I was torn about the wisdom of this agreement. On one side, I was concerned about the possible economic consequences, loss of jobs, for instance. But there were two political considerations. I've generally been favorably disposed to free trade agreements because they foster closer economic ties between countries, and that translates into greater integration, greater interdependence, thereby lowering the probability of political conflict, perhaps even war. A second, and perhaps more important factor, is that the agreement was clearly meant to be a counterweight to the Chinese economic juggernaut. For President Trump, it might have constituted a powerful piece of leverage against China because China was not a signator to the agreement. For countries like Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand, the agreement was critical not only as a counterweight to China, but a statement of support from the United States. A clear sign that America is not ready to just abandon them in the face of China's growing regional influence. Ironically, one outcome of the agreement's death was to potentially drive some of the Pacific Rim countries closer to China, with China establishing the Asian Infrastructure Bank to fund development across the region and pressing forward with its regional comprehensive economic partnership to further lower tariffs among the 16 nations of the Asia-Pacific region. That fear of China's growing influence is now, of course, playing out in the South China Sea, where no fewer than 7 countries lay claim to various areas of water, as well as the island complexes, the most well-known being the Spratling and Paracel Islands. The South China Sea itself is enviable maritime real estate. Through it run the sea lanes that provide passage for more than half of the world's oil traffic. Its hydrocarbon and mineral resources reportedly are substantial. Fishing rights also are essential for every country in the region. The Chinese have relentlessly been constructing port facilities and airfields on the islands. In response to criticism, they contend that they are merely catching up to the facilities constructed by other regional countries that have been built over the years, an assertion that is patently false. President Trump has sent naval vessels into the region, most recently the aircraft carrier group led by the USS Carl Vinson and its complement of F-18 aircraft. How far would the Trump administration go to try to reverse China's claims in this region? Would we actually go to war to do it? I doubt it. A much more likely action would be to deploy more naval vessels into the region to ensure that China does not interfere with the right of passage through the area. But who knows? Steve Bannon is on record predicting a U.S. war with China in the South China Sea within 8 to 10 years. And finally, on China, one additional comment. The issue of North Korea and its nuclear and strategic missile program. The United States and most of the countries in the region need China's assistance in curbing North Korea's program. Frankly, I think their efforts thus far have been pretty weak. But there is growing evidence that China is losing patience with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean president. Frankly, it does not want to see North Korea have a large nuclear weapons cache. So maybe a deal could be struck. Definitive pressure on North Korea to cease and desist in exchange for a reduction in the 26,000 American troops just south of the demilitarized zone. We shall see. The whole idea of negotiating on this issue was rejected by the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson the other day, and instead he said the U.S. would not take the military option off the table. Of course, virtually every president refuses to take the military option off the table. There's nothing new about that. The real question is whether the president would, in fact, use military force to try and halt North Korea's nuclear program. The Middle East, as you all know, is a very complex place. And trying to decipher a Middle East policy of any president, much less Donald Trump, is difficult. So what I've decided to do is choose 3 areas of concern to comment on: Israel and the Palestinians, ISIS, and Iran. It was widely reported during Israeli President Netanyahu's recent visit to Washington that President Trump had abandoned the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. The two-state solution refers to a formula for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict which calls for an independent state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel west of the Jordan River. The framework of the solution is set out in a UN resolution going back to 1974, over 4 decades ago, and for some time now it has been accepted by the United States as part and parcel of any solution. So what did Trump actually say about this? In fact, at the joint Netanyahu-Trump press conference, the president did not mention the two-state solution in his prepared remarks. Instead, he spoke only in general terms about a peace deal that will demand flexibility and compromises for both sides. No big deal. When he was specifically asked about the two-state solution, Trump said he doesn't rule out any option. 1 state, 2 states, or something else, as long as it will be accepted by both parties, Israel and the Palestinians. Trump also told Netanyahu that Israel would have to hold back a bit on settlements, implying that he realizes there's a territorial dimension to this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. His tone and words on settlements weren't nearly as harsh as those of his predecessor, Barack Obama. Yet he also made clear that those in Israel who might have expected a blank check from Trump on settlement building will probably be disappointed. Well, how should Trump's remarks be interpreted? The answer to this question is open to different interpretations. In Israel, some right-wing politicians and pundits openly celebrated Trump's words and presented them as official death certificate to the two-state solution, which they despise. Others, however, saw this statement as simply stating that the terms of the peace deal will have to be negotiated by both parties, and the United States will not impose terms on the parties. For Trump, the vital interest is a peace agreement, preferably one that involves not just Israel and Palestinians, but also other Arab states. If that peace deal will only be possible in the framework of a two-state solution, so be it. If there are other ways to get it, Trump is also open to examining them. The important thing from his point of view is an agreement that both sides can accept. In my judgment, the statement has the potential, and I've got to really emphasize potential, to be a positive step. Now, why do I say that? It seems to me that the Israeli-Palestinian problem has for years been frozen, or perhaps better put, paralyzed. And when you have a prolonged situation like that, sometimes you need something, either an internal or external action or event, to alter the equation, if you will. Perhaps the United States altering its perspective a bit on a possible solution to the problem will encourage the parties to revisit their thinking. I don't know. What is evident to any observer is that all the parties were restricted by the hard positions they had taken for decades, and the prospects for genuine peace talks, much less agreement, between Israel and the Palestinians were almost non-existent. The wild card in all of this, of course, is the existence and activities of Hamas, the violently anti-Israeli Palestinian faction in Gaza. If Israel is not open to negotiating with them, and or if Hamas refuses to deal with Israel, I'm not convinced it makes any difference what President Trump says or does. Now, I must tell you that my feelings about President Trump's pronouncements on ISIS are much less favorable, particularly his comments during the campaign. To be blunt, he made some pretty ludicrous assertions. For instance, that he knew more about ISIS than the generals did, and that we should not take nuclear weapons off the table when considering bombing ISIS out of existence. I thought at the time those statements were ridiculous. But there were other comments that were more serious and could well be precursors of actual policy. The first had to do with bombing the Iraqi oil fields that ISIS had seized and were primary source of revenue, and even made some references that we should seize the oil fields for ourselves. Well, there are two problems with that. The actual number of oil fields held by ISIS was pretty small, and most of their oil revenue actually came from fields inside Syria, not Iraq. Second, destroying what oil fields ISIS held only served to destroy valuable Iraqi infrastructure of a country we were trying to help. Other assertions concerning the defeat of ISIS were as follows: a call for an international conference focused on the goal of defeating ISIS, working closely with NATO on this new mission, find common ground with Russia in the fight against ISIS, and aggressively pursue joint and coalition military operations to crush and destroy ISIS, international cooperation to cut off their funding, expand intelligence sharing, and cyber warfare to disrupt and disable their propaganda and recruiting. Actually, these are not bad suggestions, but they imply that he is somehow ignoring what is already happening. As for the participation of other countries, there is already a coalition of 57 countries involved in the military confronting ISIS, although not all of them play a direct or combat role. NATO countries already participating in airstrikes against ISIS in Iraq include Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Netherlands, United Kingdom, and France. France is not a full member of NATO, but a participant in NATO's integrated military command. NATO countries participating in airstrikes against ISIS in Syria include Canada, France, Turkey, the United Kingdom, as well as the United States. It should also be noted that Australia has also a fighter-bomber contingent fighting in both theaters. And finally, we already have heavy commitment of cyber forces, both monitoring and, where appropriate, disrupting ISIS recruiting and communication on the internet. And one has to be careful here, because ISIS' use of the internet has proven to be a valuable source of intelligence. It appears that ISIS forces have been gradually degraded over the past 24 months, and all indications are that they will likely to continue to lose real estate. Beyond all this, however, the big question is what is entailed in the plan for the defeat of ISIS the President had requested from the Pentagon. Will that plan involve the large-scale deployment of Americans and other ground forces? The inside word is no. The plan does not involve large deployments of U.S. ground forces, only smaller increments, which have already begun, mostly made up of special operations forces. In my judgment, the military defeat of ISIS in Iraq and Syria is feasible. Indeed, I think it is likely. But there remain some important questions that Trump has not addressed. Can the ISIS ideology be defeated? Will a military defeat only feed the narrative of the Western world waging war on Islam and ultimately lead to a resurgence of ISIS in other forms? And the question of other forms leads to the second question. Will a military defeat of ISIS lead to an accelerated diffusion of ISIS around not only the Middle East, but around the world? Will ISIS, as it seems they are already doing, go globally underground in a vast network of terrorist cells far more extensive than anything we've seen so far? And finally, assuming ISIS can be militarily defeated, what is the end game in Syria? Can the country be stabilized? What of the thousands of rebels in opposition to the current government? What will be the role of the United States and Russia in any post-ISIS Syria? All interesting questions that must be addressed to some degree by the Trump administration. And finally, a few comments on Iran. While there's understandably a great deal of worry about ISIS, as a security threat to the United States. The fact is that the most dangerous threat emanating from the Middle East region is Iran. Its political stability, its geography lying on the Persian Gulf across from Saudi Arabia, its size, both geographic and population, the strength of its conventional forces, its nuclear program, and the fact that it continues its quest to establish the Middle East as an Iranian sphere of influence. It has relentlessly pursued the latter by increasing its military deployments in Syria, helping the regime of President Bashar Assad to preserve his grip on power. It has tightened its control of Baghdad by boosting support of Iraq's Shiite militias. It continues to support Hezbollah in Lebanon. It has shipped boatloads of arms to the Houthi proxies in Yemen and has funneled money to the Palestinian terrorist group Hamas and backed violent Shiite proxies in Bahrain. Now, a lot of this activity seems to have taken a back seat to the controversy surrounding the Iranian nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to curb and delay Iran's nuclear program. There are a couple of things to note about the agreement that are important in predicting and/or assessing President Trump's policy toward Iran. First, the agreement is not bilateral. In other words, between the U.S. and Iran. Aligned with the U.S. in the negotiations were China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Germany. Second, as noted by President Obama himself, the agreement was viewed narrowly, focusing strictly on Iran's nuclear program. It was in no way linked to other forms of nefarious behavior on the part of Iran. Third, the agreement was not the worst deal ever negotiated by the United States, as often characterized by Donald Trump on the campaign trail. I personally would nominate the Versailles Treaty, with its reparations on Germany, which was a direct connection to World War II. But nevertheless, it was an imperfect document, probably the most often cited criticism being that it only delayed Iran's nuclear program by about a decade. It did not in any way halt it permanently. While the agreement is not perfect, I think it would be a terrible mistake to tear it up, as Donald Trump promised during the campaign. Nor do I think the president will tear it up, and for the following reasons. First, it would give the green light for Iran to restart its nuclear program. Second, such a move would leave the other signatories to the agreement, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, and China, hanging and no doubt furious. Third, despite his criticism of the agreement, breaking it would put Israeli President Netanyahu in a terrible position. He would be forced to consider unleashing his air force and missiles in an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, something that the Israeli military command has told him will fail. Why? Because so many of the Iranian nuclear complexes are deep underground and require the use of powerful bunker-busting warheads, warheads that only the United States possesses and carefully guards. Further, the Israeli High Command has told Netanyahu that Israel cannot win an all-out war with Iran should it come to that. It is just too big, its army is too large, its weapons too numerous, and its close proximity an enormous advantage. A fourth reason the agreement will not be torn up is that the negotiations that took place opened up a direct communication channel between the United States and Iran. For decades after the Iranian hostage crisis, direct contacts, much less open communications, were almost non-existent. That in and of itself can be dangerous. The most important communication channels in international relations are between adversaries. Without them, countries are vulnerable to miscommunication, misinformation, and prone to mistakes when dealing with each other. Finally, Iran has proven valuable in the fight against ISIS by increasing its military assets in fighting the Islamic State, both in Iraq and in Syria, in large part because both ISIS and Al-Qaeda are Sunni in origin and sworn enemies of the Shiite Iran. So I would look for the Trump administration to concentrate on increasing the sanctions on Iran in response to violations of the nuclear agreement. Secretary of Defense James Mattis seems to agree and stated that the United States makes good on its commitments, and the Iran nuclear deal is no exception. The new Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, is on board as well. Well, I've talked long enough, probably far too long. An interesting, somewhat uncertain and challenging history is unfolding before our eyes. We do have some small windows to peer through, giving us some idea of where U.S. foreign policy is, or at least might be going. But as I said, those windows are small, and we may have to wait a while to get a better idea of where we are going. Thank you very much.
Of information, and all the TV stations could not have done a better job. You are phenomenal.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Where we get our information from, and you're unbiased, and you were able to give us all sides. Whether you're biased or not doesn't matter. You didn't do it here.
I'll be happy to take any questions if you want.
Okay, questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Can't hear.
I'm sorry. I can't hear you. I can't hear. Go ahead.
I heard this NPR discussion about this tax plan and Trump and his friend Steve trying to change the entire monetary system here. How the tax plan may come out. It will be the small groups who are going to suffer, but they're working on
Yeah.
many countries are coming into the same deal.
Can you repeat it so that everybody...
Yeah, I'm not really that qualified to talk on the tax plan and proposals by Donald Trump. I will say this. If Donald Trump thinks that any national health care plan is complicated, it is nothing compared to the United States tax code. The tax code is an absolute labyrinth. It is a nightmare. And the notion that he is going to rally his deeply divided Republican Party in the House in particular to come together to completely revamp the tax code is fanciful. It's not going to happen. I think the best that he can get will be a short-term bill, perhaps, that lowers taxes for the middle class, the upper 1%, the rich of the rich, and some corporate taxes. And I think that's it. I don't think he'll get anything more in terms of tax reform because it's just too complicated. And when I say complicated, it's not only the sheer volume of the tax code, it's that there are hundreds and hundreds of private interests, hundreds of lobbyists representing those interests that conflict with each other, that have absolutely vital interest in preserving certain parts of the tax code. And they are going to invade Washington. And he is going to have a terrible time along with Paul Ryan trying to manage that. So I think you're going this is my own personal opinion, I think you're going to hear a lot about tax reform. And I think it's going to mean a modest tax decrease for certain stratas of society, and that's it. There is not going to be a complete overhaul of the tax code.
There's going to be a big article in the New York Times magazine section.
Right.
This Sunday.
Yeah. I'm not saying he won't try, but I don't think he can do it. And again, that's a personal opinion. A personal opinion in an area that's not really my expertise. Yeah.
I loved your speech. Climate change.
Yeah.
This whole rolling back and saying, denying that there's a climate change. Some statements from you.
Yeah, I think that what the administration has done in just the last few days is terrible. It is a terrible denial of the consensus of the scientific community for years now. I mean, it's not something we just discovered yesterday. The only reason I can attribute to the total rejection of scientific evidence is economic. They want to make more money. I think it's as simple as that. And I think that let me finish. I think that it's really catastrophic. And from an international relations standpoint, I think it's going to leave the door wide open for China to assume leadership in the fight against climate change. They've already committed tremendous, they have a horrible pollution problem, as many of you know. Any of you have been to Beijing or Shanghai, know this, it's pretty bad. But they are already leading in wind power and so forth, and I think they're going to see this as a wide open opportunity. There's going to be a huge market internationally for all those wind turbines and everything else, solar panels and whatnot, and I think they're going to take the leadership role right away from us is what's going to happen. I think it was terribly short-sighted.
Right. Thank you.
Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Where does Japan stand in all this, in relation to China and to the Koreas?
Yeah, that's a good question. Japan, to a certain extent, I think, is being overshadowed by Japan. Now, Japan is being overshadowed by China and its sheer size, its economic growth, and so forth. And the Japanese economy has been struggling for the last 3 decades. The best you can say is probably minimal growth and a lot of stagnation. That's worrisome. But that whole dynamic between China and Japan is a really long story, as you know, going way back. They don't particularly like each other for a lot of good reasons. And I suspect that it's going to be somewhat difficult for Japan. On the other hand, if Donald Trump absolutely believes that China is the biggest threat in the Pacific, along the Pacific Rim, to our security, then Japan's the natural ally. Now, the basic alliance that we have with Japan, as far as I know, is pretty sound. We do a lot of naval basing in Japan. We don't have, I'm going to put this in parentheses and quotations, we don't have any nuclear warheads in Japan. They're all in Korea, because Japan doesn't want nuclear warheads in Japan, going back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I put it in parentheses and quotes because I've talked to a lot of Navy people, and they kind of chuckle when you say that, because some of the warships that go into the harbors actually have some nuclear warheads. But there's none stationed on land in Japan, any of the islands. And Japan remains a bulwark of that security system along the Pacific Rim, along with South Korea, certainly the northern part on the East China Sea. And I think it will remain that way. I think that there was a lot of, as I said, hyperbole and exaggeration and wild claims about Japan not paying its fair share, along with South Korea and the Europeans and all that. I don't think he's going to do very much about that. I don't care what he said in the campaign. If he has half a brain, he's going to know that Japan is is absolutely critical for the security along the Pacific Rim. And what's he going to do? Go after our allies? That's crazy. At the same time that China's building its military up and moving into the South China Sea, I think it's nuts. And I don't think he'll do it, quite frankly. I think the costs are just too great. But, who knows? But I think Japan is... I think our relationship with Japan is still fairly solid, but obviously China has several years ago, actually more than a couple of decades ago, surpassed Japan as a chief trading partner. We are the most important market for China, and we do an awful lot of business with China. And that's another thing too that I want to dispel, and again, this is my own judgment based on a lot of reading, but it's still my own judgment. This notion that if all of a sudden manufacturing leaves China, the notion that all the jobs that come back to the United States is myth. That ain't going to happen. You have, first place, you've got India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Malaysia. You have got a ton of other countries which are cheap labor sources, number one. Secondly, what's going to happen is the same thing. It was a good article in the Times on this morning about the coal industry. The coal industry, yeah, it may come back, but it's going to come back with driverless trucks and automated robots. They're going to do all the digging. They're not going to be a lot of jobs for these guys. And I think it was purely political, holding out this hope that this rush of manufacturing back to the United States, saving all these jobs, and I just don't think it's going to happen. And ultimately, I think it'll catch up to the White House. Yeah.
Why do you think Trump would want to dismantle NATO and align himself more with the Russians? And will he do that?
Let's put it this way. There are probably some pragmatic reasons for that, maybe what I would call genuine reasons. There is a whole series of what I call dark side theories about that. And I didn't put them in here. I know what some of them are, only because they are dark side theories. We don't know. I mean, one obviously is that he's indebted to these oligarchs, that he borrowed tons of money from these guys. And the important thing, and yeah, the banks and the rich, the new billionaires. The real problem here is not that he may have borrowed all this money. It's the link between, that fuzzy line between the oligarchs and the government. We have somewhat of a separation, at least until this last administration. We have this separation between corporate heads and CEOs and all these guys and the government, all right? There is no separation in Russia. As Russia became an independent state after the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, the oligarchs rose in power, and as Vladimir Putin worked his way into the head of the country, he disposed of those oligarchs that he didn't like and thought were a threat, and the other ones he embraced, and they are very close to him. And they guard his own personal interests. So the problem with the business of dealing with the oligarchs is you may actually be dealing with Vladimir Putin in doing that, and that he somehow is beholden to these guys and wants to. The second is that there are huge economic interests in the Trump empire that are held either jointly or exclusively by the Russians, and he wants to protect that. Those are kind of the the darkest theory of all is this blackmail thing that the former KGB, the state security system in Russia, has got something on Donald Trump, an affair in a Moscow hotel or something. There's no proof of that.
Or a copy of his tax return.
Well, tax returns too, which is an interesting question of why he doesn't release them. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, in terms of the United Nations being better than the League of Nations.
Yes.
When they had the war with the Serbian.
Yeah.
The Serbian, the UN said, oh, we will do this, but they never did it. When they finally did it, then the Serbs backed down.
Well, they didn't actually do it. It was NATO that did it with Clinton. Unfortunately, the UN did send in peacekeepers, a sizable number of them. A lot of them got killed. Some of them got captured, and the whole peacekeeping effort fell apart. And it was at that point, after Srebrenica, that Clinton just finally said enough was enough. He took the bull by the horns. Most of Bosnia Herzegovina was destroyed by that time. So the major operation by NATO under Clinton's leadership took place in Kosovo to preserve Kosovo. To the broader issue of the United Nations, it's a flawed organization. There's no question about that. I used to tell my students, because I used to teach on the UN program, that in terms of peace and security, nothing gets done unless the 5 permanent members of the Security Council say so, period. End of argument. The General Assembly, none of the General Assembly resolutions are mandatory. They have no force of international law, only those out of the Security Council. And with the veto power being held by the 5 permanent members, it's very difficult to get them together. Now, that doesn't mean the UN doesn't do a lot of good work. I think it does. And I think it would be a shame to downgrade it. I think it would be disgraceful if we reduced our contributions, our mandatory contributions, which has been threatened before.
I didn't mean to get rid of it, I was just a
That's,
comment.
no, I understand. But this president is not enamored with the United Nations, as a lot of conservatives are not. But if you take a careful look at what they do, I have a former student working in Zimbabwe right now. She's head of the AID mission, which is now under threat because of the proposed budget cuts. I mean, she does absolutely marvelous work down there. And you think of, we now have more refugees than at any time in the history of the world. More refugees, millions of them. And what do? We just abandon these people? We just say, well, it's too bad, collateral damage to conflict. And we're facing another famine in Ethiopia and in South Sudan. These are human tragedies of enormous scale. And the United Nations does an awful lot of good work in those areas, in addition to development and so forth. So I think it's very short-sighted to cut the funds of the UN, which is proposed in the budget. Yes, ma'am.
Can you comment about the wall that's going to be built?
Well, let me say this. I don't know what's going to happen with the wall. There might be some effort to go ahead and get it and start building it, although I think Congress, particularly, I don't particularly like the Freedom Caucus, but they may prove useful here. The cost is enormous. The whole notion, as I said in the talk here, that the wall is being put up to keep terrorists out is absolute nonsense. I think that the whole notion, and I don't want to repeat everything I said here, but I think the whole notion of the wall is linked to the travel bans and whatnot, and the taking and deporting the illegals in the United States, and in some cases breaking families up. I think it's all linked. There are forces in this country that just do not want outsiders here, forgetting that most of their own origins probably came from immigrants. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Can you comment about North Korea?
Yeah, well, let me put it this way. I think North Korea's primary goal in life is survival of that state. Everything they do is geared to that. I think the odds are minuscule that when they fully develop a long-range missile with a nuclear warhead on it, that they would ever launch it on U.S. territory, whether it be Alaska, whether it be Hawaii. Listen, mutually assured destruction is not dead. If they were to do that, there is absolutely no question in my mind that North Korea would cease to exist. Pyongyang would be destroyed, flattened. And I think they have been told that in no uncertain terms. Everybody talks about the erratic young leader and he is brutal. There's no question. I mean, he kills his uncle and stuff in horrible ways, and it's not pleasant. A lot of starvation, but I just don't think that's going to happen. I think a more likely thing that could happen would be the accidental or unintentional triggering of a conflict along the demilitarized zone. And that could happen if we're not careful. And like I said, communication between adversaries is the most important communication in international relations. We not only have our 26,000 troops immediately up against the DMZ, South Korea has thousands of their troops. On the other side, there are over 100,000 artillery pieces of the North Koreans buried in tunnels in the walls. Now, we have the same thing on our side too, on the south side. But if there should be an accidental triggering from a misunderstanding and there was a full exchange, the destruction would be unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. And we would lose a lot of troops, there's no question about that. And that, to me, is a more likely scenario than him just going off haywire and launching a nuclear weapon against Japan or against Honolulu or something like that. I don't think that's going to happen. I hope I'm right. Okay,
You were
thank you.
absolutely fantastic. I have the one question. I saw the show the other day. The most powerful man in the world, they said, is Putin. Do you think Putin or Trump? I thought Trump, but that's what I thought. They had the program.
You know, I think sometimes the games of trying to figure out who the most powerful man in the world is very difficult. One might look at somebody like Bezos, the head of Amazon, or Bill Gates, the head of Microsoft, before you start naming Vladimir Putin. You know, if you came up with a list of the 5 most powerful men in the world, then they would obviously make the list. But picking that one on the top, I think, is he's got some problems at home with these protests. We'll have to see what happens.
Well, you were fabulous.
Thank you.
Everything.